Well, thank you all for coming to this forum on our budget situation at Columbus State. As you all know, we are facing an enormous budgetary challenge this year. We're a strong and vital institution, and we're essential to the community. So there is no question that we will recover from this current budgetary challenge. But we are going to face some lean times as we make our way back to prosperity. And during those times, it's important that we all not lose sight of the fact of our essential nature and how critical we are to the welfare and prosperity of our community and indeed to all of Central Ohio. All of you have combined to build Columbus State into a truly remarkable institution. One is really moved at commencement by the kinds of comments that students make. They not only single out faculty as having been very helpful to them throughout their undergraduate careers, but they will say with heartfelt gratitude that someone in the admissions office or financial aid or in our maintenance staff took the time at a really critical point in their undergraduate careers when they had doubts about whether they could succeed to lift them up and give them confidence that they could complete their degree or their certificate. So when we talk about Columbus State being an institution that's essential, we truly mean all of us at Columbus State. There is no one here who does not do work that is essential to student success. But we've reached a point now, even in the midst of our challenging budgetary times, when we've reached a fork in the road and we need to decide whether we will be a critical part of moving forward or we will be on the sidelines of the parade hoping for trinkets coming to us from on high. I hope that we choose to play our rightful role as we move forward. We face enormous challenges as a state and as a nation. When you look at the world, it is a very different place. For nearly 200 years, the United States stood astride the world unchallenged economically and in most cases militarily. That is no longer the case. When you look at the nations of the Pacific Rim, China, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, those are strong economic nations, and there is no question that we now will need to compete at a much higher level to maintain our influence in the world and our own prosperity for ourselves and our citizens. To do that, we clearly will need to be ever more attentive to having the right programs, the right level of challenge, and a dedication from all of us to having more and more students succeed at a higher level so that we can compete in an increasingly global and challenging world. But in Central Ohio, the industry, our educators, and our citizens have turned to us and said that we are essential to Central Ohio in unique ways. They have said it is important that we increase dramatically the number of students who complete certificates, 2-year degrees, and 4-year degrees. They have said, Columbus State, you are the institution that is essential to this. Only you can be the doorway of access for the students who do not now aspire toward higher education. And so we have that sacred mission before us. Also, industry has turned to us and said, we are facing greater global competition. We need a workforce that is ever more skilled in the way that we need it to be competitive in a global economy. And so we will need to be attentive to ways we have not been, to be very closely connected to our businesses and our industries throughout Central Ohio. Finally, as all of you know, there is an enormous readiness gap between high schools and higher education. And through the President's Central Ohio Compact, we have been identified as the essential institution of higher learning to work very closely with high schools in supporting them and in helping them understand that gap and in lifting their students to a higher level so that they can succeed in higher education without the truly many semesters and sometimes years of remediation that we currently require. This is, again, an immense challenge, but I would say to you that there is no greater gift in life than to be necessary to your state and to your nation, and indeed to your world, in a time of uncertainty. We have that gift, and I hope that all of us will, even in these challenging times, accept that gift and work in ever greater ways to meet the challenge that face us. Great Britain, which in the 18th and 19th centuries occupied a position not unlike ours, in which they stood astride the world. The sun never set on the British Empire during those centuries, often faced difficult times of its own. And in closing, I would quote to you as a sort of paradigm for us the words of William Blake, who was one of the great thinkers of the early Victorian age, which was the height of the British Empire. In writing to his citizens, he wrote the following. He said, "Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my sword, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword slip from my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." That was a meaningful and eloquent challenge then, and I think it applies now. And as Terry Gear takes you through the details of our current budget situation, I hope that you will build on the terrific work you have done to bring Columbus State to this point and use that inspiration as we move to an ever higher level. Thank you, and now Terry.
Thanks, Dr. Cooley, for giving us the overview. I'm going to go over numbers today as to where we've been budget-wise, enrollment-wise, and what I want to share today, what we know about our current budget and our future budget and what we don't know. So I'll start by taking a look back the last 10 years, from fiscal year 02 through fiscal year 12. Dr. Harrison showed this slide at our last in-service, and over that period of time, from 02 to fiscal year 12, our headcount grew by 37%. Our full-time equivalents, which is an even more important number because we get funded on full-time equivalents, grew over that period of time by 54%. The single largest gain was in fiscal year 2010. We grew by 16.6% on headcount, 18.3% on full-time equivalent. For those of you who were here in fiscal year 2005, that was our single biggest drop over the last 10 years. We lost 8.6% in headcount and 6.2% in full-time equivalent students. If you take those outliers out, we on average grow 3.25%. It took us 4 years, by the way, to bounce back after we lost enrollment in fiscal year 05 to the level before that drop. In fiscal year 13, when we were planning our budget, we assumed that we would experience a 5% enrollment decline because we were going to switch to semesters. And schools that had switched to semesters long before we did shared their experiences with us, and it's pretty common for institutions who switch to lose enrollment. So we budgeted a 5% decline. we started to be really prudent about our budget even before it was effective on July 1st. When we started to see what was happening with summer quarter enrollment, it was actually going to be lower than our 5% assumption, and when summer quarter was said and done, we lost 13.8% in enrollment when compared to the prior summer, and that was our last term in quarters. As we were proceeding through summer, we were planning budget adjustments because we wanted to be in line with what the board had approved as our budget, so we needed to reduce expenses because our revenue was not coming in as we had budgeted. In autumn, when all was said and done, we lost 24.5% in full-time equivalent students. And then for spring, we have in our adjusted budget planned for an additional 5% decline in spring because our trend in the past years has been that what used to be winter term was always lower than autumn. So we're assuming an additional 5% decline in enrollment, full-time equivalents in the spring for planning purposes. So why did we see the decrease in enrollment? A couple reasons. First of all, our students did what we asked them to do. We encouraged our students who were in the quarter terms to finish under quarters if they were close enough to do that, and a lot of students did that. We had the largest graduating classes in the history of Columbus State in both spring quarter and summer quarter of 2012. We had fewer returning students, about 19.5% fewer than we had last autumn. We also had fewer new students, about 16% fewer students. And also those students who were returning were taking fewer classes because they weren't yet used to a semester environment. Seems a little intimidating to take 4 or 5 classes when you're used to taking 3. So students took 1.3 fewer credit hours on average, which is about 12.7% in autumn semester. We're already starting to see a rebound per student in the number of credit hours that they're taking as we watch carefully enrollment for spring semester. But these are the factors that contributed to the decrease in enrollment. So here's our fiscal year 13 budget, and I'm going to go over it at the highest levels. So when the board approved our budget in May, the board has to approve a budget in May for the fiscal year that starts July 1st. The board approved a budget of $158.1 million. They approved expenses of $155.4 million. Again, this is based on an assumption of a 5% enrollment decline. And then there's a category in our budget called transfers, which includes $3.3 million for capital equipment and about $1.5 million to pay off our debt, which is basically a mortgage. Our debt payments are like a mortgage. So that left us in a negative position of $1.8 million. So in order to balance the budget, we asked the board to set aside if we could use some of our reserves for the budget, and we asked for $3.9 million, which left us in our initial plan with a bottom line of a positive $2.1 million, which became very important as our revenue numbers started to change and our enrollment started to be lower than we expected. So in revising our budget, again, aggressively pursuing that at the start of the year when it's easier to revise your budget than it is once you're into the year and spending your monies, we revised our revenue down to $141.2 million. The impact of the enrollment declines was $16.9 million in tuition revenue. So we had to reduce our revenue by $16.9 million, or about 11%, and we had to commensurately reduce our expenses. And we did that by reducing $12.3 million in expenses, and we used the balance of the reserves that the board set aside for us, so we didn't take as deep an expense reduction as we would otherwise if we hadn't had the reserves to fall back on. So we do have a balanced budget right now that we're working toward keeping in balance, and we will be monitoring this carefully as we look at spring semester enrollment, and if we go deeper than 5% more enrollment decline than we had in autumn, we'll have to be looking at expenses again more carefully still than we've already done. But we're going to be doing that work over the coming weeks, and we will be keeping the college apprised. This slide basically gives a little more detail about how we reduced the budget by $16.9 million given the tuition revenue. 75 to 80% of our budget is people, those of us who work at the college. And so to come up with almost $17 million in budget savings, we have decided to hold positions that have become vacant, except in the most critical area where we don't have any other options for flexibility. We're holding positions vacant. Many of them are the ones that became vacant through the voluntary separation program. A lot of our colleagues left pursuant to that program. This year, it's about 30, last year about 60, and what that program served to do is to slow the growth of our payroll. So we're holding vacant positions for the duration of this year. We also, one of our variable expenses, variable to enrollment, is our adjunct expense. So of the $16.9 million reduction in expenses that we took, just over $7 million was a reduction in our costs for adjuncts. We have also held off on buying capital equipment, except for the most critical items that we needed to launch autumn semester. We have reduced our travel lines, our conference lines, and other discretionary expenses. And we are also embarking soon on our holiday cost savings initiative, serving students only online during the week between Christmas and New Year, so that we can realize savings both in payroll and in energy savings and related costs of running the college. And as I mentioned, we have been able to use reserves the board authorized to balance this budget. $3.1 million was used out of our, what I call the rainy day fund, to weather this year's transitions, and then $0.8 million we used to buy out our colleagues through the voluntary separation program. And I will also be going over reserves in a bit more detail just generally, but this is how we reduced our budget on the expense side to be commensurate with the projected revenue. We've already begun planning for fiscal year 14. A lot of the reductions that we took this year to meet our budget, we tried to be as strategic as we could be in a reactive environment. Many of the reductions we took aren't sustainable, and we know that. And so we're looking at planning for fiscal year 14. We've already begun thinking about strategic initiatives, further strategic reductions in expenses. How can we be more efficient and more flexible in how we operate our college? And we're thinking about adjusting business practices that may have needed a review, and how we can be more efficient in how we do business. And of course, our number one principle in planning for fiscal year 14 is student success. And so we're looking at strategic enrollment, recruitment. How can we reestablish our enrollment here at the college? We're going to have to work harder for our enrollment than we have in the past, because we're being more intentional about how we serve students and their success. We are, again, looking at expense reductions. We're looking at ways to generate revenue, and we're looking at what we may need to stop doing so that we can reallocate the monies we use for some things to our strategic agenda. So those are the general principles that are leading us into planning for fiscal year 14, which starts on July 1st, 2013. I want to talk about how we use our reserves. I get a lot of questions about the reserves, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time on how we use the monies that we have in what amounts to to make it analogous to a personal situation, kind of accounts similar to our personal savings account. We have the monies we use to operate, pay the bills, buy groceries, pay utilities, and then we have the monies we set aside for one-time expenses like college educations, braces for our children, roof replacements, and other things that come about once in a while that we have to be ready for. So we use our reserves for similar kinds of purposes. The first way we think about our reserves is as a venture capital source of money. How can we spend some money that we've set aside to accelerate our ability to serve more students in the Central Ohio region? An example of that is our Reynoldsburg project that you may have read about recently. We are in partnership with Reynoldsburg City Schools, and Reynoldsburg gave us the opportunity, gave us space to operate a regional learning center. And Reynoldsburg came to the table and said that we will put $1.6 million into renovating the space for Columbus State if you put in the monies to furnish and equip the space, and then we have an arrangement with the district on the academics of a partnership as well. So that's a venture capital opportunity. Delaware campus was similar. The state was very generous in giving us $25 million to build the campus, build the building, build the infrastructure, build the parking, but the state does not give you money to start the operations of a center, of a campus. So we were able to use some of our reserves to help pay for the expenses in the first 3 years of the campus, and that money is allowing us to grow our enrollment and then to earn the subsidy that comes with that from the state, because you don't earn the subsidy until the year or two after you have the enrollment, because the state pays us in arrears. So the monies we get from the state this year are paid for the average of the enrollments we've had the last 2 years. And then finally, the third strategic purpose for which we use reserves is for the proverbial rainy day. Some might argue that this fiscal year is a rainy day for us, and certainly the board gave us the latitude to use some of that monies so that we didn't have to reduce expenses as much as we might otherwise have had to if we didn't have the ability to tap into our reserves to help us through this year. So I want to give you a 10-year look at how we have accumulated reserves and what percentage of our operating fund those reserves represent, and how that's changed over time. So going back again 10 years to fiscal year 2002, our operating budget was half of what it is now, $75.6 million. Our fund balance, or our reserves/savings, were $44.5 million, or about 58.9%. And a rule of thumb for keeping money in your sock, as Dr. Harrison would say, is you want to keep 6 to 8 months of operating monies. This is true personally as well. 6 to 8 months of operating monies if something calamitous happens in your ability to earn income. So that's another way to look at reserves. And how much do you want to keep set aside for that kind of a calamitous situation? That's a key question in managing the college's finances. So that was fiscal year 2002. Fiscal year 2005, our budget had grown to $97.8 million. Our fund balance was almost $60 million, which represents, same ballpark, 58.9% in 2002, 61.1% in 2005. Fiscal year 2009, our budget was $117.2 million. Our fund balance was $106.5 million. So that grew to about 91%. That's the fund balance as a percentage of the operating. So because of our growth, because of the monies we were getting from the state and subsidies, we were able to have net income for a few years that allowed us to set that money aside so that we had up to a 90.1% fund balance as a percentage of our operating monies. Fast forward to fiscal year 12. We now have a budget of, fiscal year 12 was this past year. $151 million was our budget. $105.5 million was our fund balance. So you can see we're starting to spend our fund balance a little bit. And that fund balance represents 69.9% of our operating budget. So the trajectory is that we went up from 58.9% up to 90.9%. And now, because we're spending our reserves for the strategic reasons that I just described, our fund balance is declining as a percentage of our operating budget. So it's down to about 69.9% at the end of fiscal year 12. In the current year, our budget, for all the reasons we've talked about, has been reduced to $145 million, and our fund balance is now projected by the end of this year to it will be $84 million, and that will be back to a range. About 10 years ago, 58% of our operating budget is what we have in reserves. So I'd like to show you what do we spend. I mean, we've spent some of our reserves. We've spent almost $20 million, for example, between 12 and what we're projected to spend this year. So what are we spending it on? This next slide shows you what we've been spending our reserves on in fiscal year 11, 2 years ago, last year, fiscal year 12, what we are projecting to spend this year in fiscal year 13, and what we already know because we've planned for it, we're going to spend in fiscal year 14. And there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but what I'd like to do is just read some of the categories of things on which we're spending money and the totals. So capital improvements, we're spending over that period of time, 4 years, about $16 million. The bulk of that spending is to renovate Union Hall. We've been really fortunate as a college over the last 10 to 15 years in terms of how much money the state has given us in capital monies. We built Technology and Learning Center using state funds. We built the Center for Workforce Development using state funds. Those two buildings total were about $39 million. We built Moeller Hall and the Delaware campus, $25 million. We renovated the library for over $5 million. All of these things were with state capital monies. Renovated Delaware Hall, state capital monies, and many other smaller projects. Union Hall renovation is the first major renovation at the college that we will be bearing the majority of the expense for. Of the $15+ million renovation for Union Hall, the state gave us $5 million in the current capital budget, and we're going to pick up the balance. So that's what that category represents. We have, over this period of time, spent $7.2 million on scholarships for students. For those of you who were here during those years when we were accumulating some net income, the board felt very strongly about giving some of it back to students. And we've done that in two ways. The first way is through the scholarship program that you may recall. It's called Think Again, and the board approved it 3 or so years ago. And the second way we've given it back and shared that good fortune with our students is by holding our tuition flat for 6.5 years. And those were two measures that allowed us to keep tuition affordable for students. We've used our reserves for other one-time expenses. One-time compensation for us as employees totaled $4.9 million. The voluntary separation incentive, we were able to buy out employees, and we spent $3.3 million on the incentive and a related $1.5 million for their vacation and other accrual buyouts. As I mentioned, the Reynoldsburg Center, we were able to put $1.4 million into that partnership. We're using $3.1 million to help us balance our budget. And you can see over this period of time, we will have spent $52.2 million of our reserves on the kinds of things that the board has authorized us to spend, but they're of a one-time nature generally. The budget stabilization, while you can rely on your reserves to get yourself through an operating year where you may not have enough revenue, continuing to do that year after year is not a sustainable practice, but we're fortunate to have that so that we can reposition ourselves to be even stronger after we get through this transition. I want to talk a little bit about state subsidy, because these are variables that affect our budget dramatically. We have two sources of income for our operating budget: state subsidy and tuition and fees from students. So the state subsidy it's a complicated formula, but it boils down to these essential factors, at least through this fiscal year. And I'll explain that in a moment. So the factors that go into calculating subsidy, and the total subsidy this fiscal year for all 23 community colleges is $403 million. It's a defined amount of money. So what happens at Cuyahoga Community College, what happens at Southern State Community College, what happens at Sinclair Community College impacts us, in addition to what happens to us by virtue of our own efforts here. So enrollment is a big piece of the formula that determines how much subsidy we get. The only number that hasn't changed in the allocations for a few years is the category called Access and Tuition Subsidy, which for us is about $8.1 million. And the reason that that hasn't changed is because in exchange for holding tuition flat for 2 years, the governor and the legislature said, if you hold tuition flat in fiscal year 08 and 09, we will give you more subsidy. And we took that, and so that number is staying constant. And there was another amount of money under the Access Challenge that once it changed in the formula and how it was going to be allocated, it too stayed flat. So those two things, access and tuition subsidy, caused this number to be constant. This is the third year that we're receiving funds for success points. And success points is what it suggests. How well are our students performing once they get to Columbus State? And you'll notice that that's a number that's increasing. In fiscal year 12, it was 6.7% of the total allocation. In 13, it's 8.8% of the total allocation, and that jump between fiscal years is a 36% increase. So completion, transfers, earning degrees, completing developmental education classes, those are the factors on which we earn points. So if a student earns a 15th credit hour in this fiscal year, we get a point for that student. So that's the success point category, and it's going to be an even larger share as we move forward. And then finally, the category called stop loss is a factor in the formula that, after all is said and done, protects an institution from losing any more than, in this year the number is 4%, losing any more than 4% of what you earned last year. It's a measure that allows us to maintain some stability as we transition given variables that affect our financials. So this year, our contribution to other colleges, others of the 23 community colleges, toward their stop loss was almost was $250,000. Our colleagues at Owens Community College had seen dramatic enrollment drops in recent years, and we are now helping to fund their stop loss provision. And given our enrollment decline in this year, we'll be the beneficiary of a stop loss provision in the ensuing budget because we had a dramatic enrollment drop, as Owens did in the past. So this is an overview of state subsidy, and this is changing as well. If you've been paying attention to the news in the last 2 or so months, the governor asked presidents of universities and colleges under the leadership of Dr. Gee to present a new funding formula for the coming budget, fiscal year 14 and 15. And the presidents they were asked to submit their recommendations by Thanksgiving, which they did. And our recommendation from the community college sector, which has been accepted by the governor and will appear in his budget, which will be introduced in February, is a decreased focus on enrollment. The governor is very interested in focusing on outcomes, not on inputs. But we were able to make the case that we needed to transition from an enrollment-based budget, largely enrollment-based, toward the success factors. And so what the community colleges proposed is that we reduce the amount to 50% using enrollment as the base, and that we move to a 25% success points, and we will also have a stop loss provision, and we will also be measured 25% on course completions. And that's what the budget will have as introduced. We won't know the final state subsidy. We actually don't know the final state subsidy until halfway through the fiscal year. So the governor will introduce his budget. It will be deliberated in the legislature. We will get some projections because we have to balance our budget in May before the state budget is even approved. So we'll have projections from the Ohio Board of Regents based on whatever we're seeing in the budget bill at the time. But even during a year when the budget isn't being deliberated, we are just now, this week, finding out and having approved by a state body called the Controlling Board our subsidy number for this fiscal year, which is halfway over. And so we balanced our budget on a projection that we received in April, keeping in mind that this is all based on projections that every community college is submitting, and it all relates one to the other. And then when our enrollments are finalized for fiscal year 12, which doesn't happen until summer, then they give us final numbers now. Those numbers between your April projection and your final number can swing dramatically. The good news for us is that it swung less dramatically this fiscal year than it had in any recent year. We are going to get less subsidy by about $60,000 from what will be final to what we use to balance our budget. In the past, that number has been as high as $500,000. So we're really fortunate that that swing didn't surprise us on top of the other challenges that we've been managing financially this year. I mentioned the President's Commission. This is just a summary of what those provisions included. I understand that over Thanksgiving and in the last week, the governor did accept the recommendations. You may have read about that in the newspaper or seen it on TV. Wanted to just touch briefly on capital funding. I had mentioned earlier that we have been the recipient of generous state funding, and this chart basically summarizes that. Again, going back to 2001, 2002, and there are three categories of funding that we had been getting from the state in the capital bill. First category is instructional and data processing, which allowed us to fund some of our capital equipment needs. Computers, everything from computers to cadavers is in our capital equipment budget. And these numbers are for a 2-year period, so $836,000, split that over 2 years, that's a nice sum of money to help us fund what we need here at the college to serve our students. There's another category called basic renovations. Again, these are 2-year allocations. So we've been the beneficiary of anywhere from $930,000 for a 2-year period to $1.7 million. And that allows us to do basic renovations, just what the name implies: replace roofs, repair parking lots, replace our boilers so our buildings are energy efficient. And those monies, well, we had no capital bill in 2011 and 12. And we got no monies in 13, 14 for basic renovations. So that tide has shifted as well, and now we have to be more responsible for our own basic renovations financially, at least for the time being, because we don't know what's coming in other capital bills. And then we got monies, project funding. That's where we've funded our academic centers or our major renovations. Those are the three categories of capital funds. And as you see, as I mentioned, it's been a generous amount of money, $60.3 million over that period of time. And all of that accumulated to $71.1 million in capital. It's unlikely that unless we come up with really creative ideas that we'll be getting that kind of money going forward to build $25 million academic centers funded by the state. And so that's another variable that we have to be mindful of. And as we are mindful of that, and as we pursue our master planning process, we're really thinking about using our master plan as a way to create more partnerships and to use it as a tool for fundraising. We're going to have to rely increasingly on fundraising. And we're also going to think about debt differently. We haven't had to issue mortgages or get a mortgage to build much here at the college. And so all of those are going to be new ways of thinking about funding our capital as we move forward. So as we move forward, planning in a little bit more detail, we did do a tuition adjustment. The board approved a tuition adjustment for our students effective summer semester. And the budget bill defines the parameters for how high an increase we can have in any given year. And again, we had held tuition for 6.5 years. When we did increase tuition in the early 2000s, our average increase was 5.3% per year. And this year, the tuition adjustment that will be effective with summer semester is 5.4%, which was the maximum allowed by the budget bill this year. We also, the board authorized us to refinance our debt. It's a good time to do that, so we're in the process of doing that to reduce our expenses for the debt we have issued for the 10 years remaining on bonds that we issued in 2003. And then the other things that we're doing in business planning, thinking about revenue generation, expense reductions, and reallocations. And finally, I just wanted to give a brief overview about how we're held accountable by external agencies for our financial management. The first is every year the state of Ohio takes our audited financial statements and puts it through a formula that yields what's called a composite score. It's a grade of our financial responsibility. The scale is 0 to 5. And it came into effect when Central State University had a financial situation that was not good. and they needed help. And so the state, as a result of that, I think it was in 1997, when the state realized that there was no monitoring of institutions of higher education and how they were doing financially, the legislature passed a bill. It's referred to as Senate Bill 6. So the score that we get is called the Senate Bill 6 score. There needed to be a way to hold us accountable so that we didn't have another institution belly up financially without anybody having had any warning. So the factors that go into it are the same factors that when we get a credit report, creditors look at. Are we spending less than we bring in? That factor has a weight of 20% in the formula. Debt management. Do we carry debt that's affordable? If we get a 20-year mortgage, is it likely that we're going to pay it off? That factor is weighted 30%. And we carry very low debt at the college as a percentage of our operating revenue. And then finally, the factor that carries the most weight in this financial analysis is how much do you have in reserves? How long could you get by if things don't go well? And that factor, as you can see, has the heaviest weight at 50%. So the goal isn't to get a 5 on a scale of 0 to 5. The goal definitely is not to get as low as 1.75 and stay there for 2 years, because if that happens, then the state is going to take over. That's the simplest way to describe it, but the scrutiny by the state will intensify the closer you get to 1.75. So over the life of this accountability measure, we have averaged 4.8. Several years we've had a 5. The goal is not to earn a 5. The goal is to know what you're doing and to be intentional in your financial management so you know how your score is impacted, so that you're not inching your way to the low end, that you are staying responsible on these 3 variables. The other external bodies who keep an eye on us financially are our rating agencies, Moody's Investors and Standard & Poor's. And again, just like we have credit reports, whether we've ever seen ours or not, we have credit reports as well. How creditworthy are we? If we have to go out and borrow money, how creditworthy are we? So the rating agencies use formulas not unlike the state. They take our financials and they put them through their own formulas and they measure us and they give us a grade. And we actually have had our Standard & Poor's rating upgraded twice in the last 10 years. The last time in June of 2010, we just had a ratings call with them, which we do every year, where they check up on us. We had that before Thanksgiving, and we're waiting on that report. And then we also have a rating from Moody's Investors. And so the better your rating is, the lower rate at which you can borrow money if and when you need to do that. The better your rating is, the more markets open up to you as somebody selling bonds to a broader array of investors. So these are, again, important measures. People are watching out for our financial management, making sure we do it well. And I just wanted to share that as my last slide in this discussion. We will keep the college apprised as we learn more. It will be after the new year. We'll have a better sense of what our spring enrollment is. We'll have a little better sense potentially of what the governor's budget portends. We'll be watching it go through the legislature, and we'll be examining a lot of initiatives that colleagues across the college are working on in the categories of planning that I talked about: revenue generation, resource allocation, strategic initiatives that will help us come out of this transition year and the next year toward our brighter future. Thank you.